Hi, everyone. I'm Mark. So I thought that I'd context set a little bit by introducing some of the center and what I do. I'm a radiologist by training, but I've spent the last couple of years mostly in early stage technology companies. And the center is about 2.5 years old. It's kind of like posing itself as an early stage technology company or organization within like a big, sometimes unwieldy healthcare system, which poses some challenges sometimes. We put together things like clinical use cases with data and analytics specialists, data scientists, and product people, people from industry. And we're learning a lot through this process, not just about machine learning, but things like how devastating it is when you put together a bunch of very competitive, analytically minded scientists and you play them Yankee swap. I lost a beautiful bottle of rum, and I got like a moleskin notebook. I'm still recovering from that. So, the center is doing a lot of different things. We're kind of in this golden age where everything old in analytics is new again because of COVNETs, and so it's really hard to decide what you're going to focus on. So we're doing a couple different things. We're doing this time series project with Adam and some of his colleagues. On high-frequency data in the ICU, digital pathology, so we're looking for features within white blood cells, which might be indicative of infection earlier if you're doing optical scanning of those cells. Novel biomarkers is pretty cool. It's something that John mentioned, this term digital data exhaust. It turns out you got a lot of that in radiology images, so you're typically in radiology, I'm not looking at every pixel. I'm typically looking at the tumor or the finding, right? And there's all this other data which can tell you a lot about the patient that we're just kind of leaving on the plate. It's kind of like value that you're leaving there. And we're packaging all this up into a set of solution suites that will be useful for a set of personas. And so that's the ultimate goal. And when I was thinking about of the different projects that we're working on, what to elevate here to kind of articulate the main thing that I want to demonstrate, which is just how things break when you try to implement one model or one solution in a different place. There were a couple different examples. I decided to go with something that's a little, say it's a little half-baked, it's a little early, but the guy who I'm doing yoga with tells me to be more positive, so we'll just go ahead with it. This is a tool that we're using to segment the aorta, which is the biggest artery in your body. And you might want to do this for a couple different things. We're principally doing it to screen for aneurysms. So as you age, and especially if you're a smoker or have hypertension, you start to get dilatation of the aorta, and that can cause problems. And we try to screen for this, but you're screening for lots of stuff pretty rapidly as a radiologist, so it'd be nice if we could automate some of this. And so we created a detector to do this with contrast and without contrast. And it's a pretty simple model, actually. We tried to figure out, let's pluck the low-hanging fruit first, right? This is like the really frustrating thing about being in this space is you pick like the simple stuff, and you figure out that the simple stuff is not so simple. And it's fascinating because you learn about all the reasons why it's not so simple. But you'd expect something like this to be quite simple. I'll show you a video of it in action. So this is, it's like the little green tracing there is, it's tracing the aorta. There was the aorta with some clot in it. So it actually performs pretty well, even when there's pathology there. So it's working pretty well, but it started to fail in ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And I'm just going to give you one example of that. So if you're a first-year radiology resident, you're always hoping for one type of patient, the really American type of patient. What do I mean by that? A really kind of fat patient. I don't know how else to say it. So this is a lot of nice, juicy, gray adipose tissue. And you know why we love that? Is because it separates all the organs. So it makes things really easy to see. It's like natural contrast. Beautiful, right? But, it doesn't necessarily work in all the populations that we'd like to be able to take this technology to, right? Our BMI in the States is a little bit different than it is in the rest of the world. Of course, the rest of the world is starting to catch up with us. So maybe the models will start working, but we'll have other problems to deal with. Well, so will this model converge in other areas? Well, it does actually. It works pretty well with all sorts of different CTs and all kinds of different body types. But it also breaks in other ways. Things like the reconstruction kernel for the CT, that is the manufacture of the CT, might be different. Or the thickness of the slices might be different. And I could probably go on, but I don't want to bore you. Suffice it to say that there's a lot of variability in the way both we acquire the data as well as the population that you're applying these models to that causes a lot of problems with these models that we have to solve. Now, one of my earlier mentors told me never to come with a problem without a solution. So I have a solution, and I'd love to hear what all of you are thinking about here. You know, a lot of people talking about federated learning these days. It's simply the process of, you know, taking a model, pushing it locally, then retraining it locally. This is a good example of it in process. I see some of the GCP folks nodding. So this is an example of using a keyboard, that's predicting what it is that you want to type. And this effectively works the same way because there's a privacy issue here. You don't want necessarily Google knowing exactly what you're typing, but you want that intelligence and you want it locally with low latency. So some of the you know, benefits of that kind of technology can be applied maybe in medicine where you have some of the same considerations. You might have a model, you might want to distribute it locally, and then you may want to retrain it and make it, you know, special for that location. So that's an example of federated learning and an example of a solution, but not the complete solution. All right, so there's a couple more problems, and I don't have the time to talk about all of this, but the model diversity, I think, is the grand challenge facing us now. So there's differences in prevalence, presentation, population substrate. Like even if you're, you know, all the healthy people look different, like I showed you, then you're going to have different in performances of these models. Prevalence is a really good example. I mean, TB in the Northeast has a much lower prevalence than it does in South Asia. How are you going to train those models? There's differences in workflows, like mammography, for example, works very differently in Europe than it does in the US. So you're actually training models not just to detect something, but how is it going to work within a workflow? In Europe, you might use this as a second reader, where mammography is typically read twice, right? So then your training and everything from the solution back to the training has to be really different. There's underserved areas. So, you know, some diagnostics and treatments are not common and available in some areas. So diagnostics are really relevant to the workflow and the environment. So what good is my MR diffusion model if you don't have an MR to confirm that you have a stroke? So MRI penetrance in the market is widely variable. Data may not be routinely collected in these underserved areas, and the infrastructure to collect and train models may not be available. Finally, we've talked a lot. Smarter people than me have talked about GDPR and differences in regulatory considerations already. So I'll just leave it at that and ask if there's any questions. Thanks.